Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we're going to do something a little bit different. I know the first 40 videos on this channel, after my reboot, have been exclusively devoted to old Yu-Gi-Oh! Going all the way back to the early 2000s, and then most recently up through 2014, but I did in fact play during the remote YCS this past weekend, although I went 2-2 drop. I did figure it would be interesting to take a look at the deck that I ran because it's a little bit of a different take on Tri-Brigade. What is the most popular deck right now, a deck that took the majority of top 32 slots, whether that's because of just sheer numbers or the fact that it might be the best deck, it's a little bit of a debate, but a deck that a lot of people obviously have a lot of familiarity with if you've been playing modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And do not fret, this is not going to be an overwhelming theme going forward. I will immediately after this video record a retro deck profile. So for those of you who have been watching my channel exclusively for retro content, this is a little bit more of a one-off, and if I do post modern, it's not going to inhibit me from also posting an equal amount of retro stuff. So before I talk about the deck itself, over the course of the past month or so, this has been really the only deck that I've run. I don't have nearly as much time as I did when I was younger to play every deck and then settle on what I think is the best deck, so instead I focused on one deck and tried to understand it to the best of my ability. This specific deck list was the thoughts combined of both me and Joe Bogley. Joe Bogley and I talked really the night before the deck lists were due about this particular deck. He himself did not play in the event, but he helped me immensely with this particular deck list. So we'll start with the typical Tri-Brigade lineup, nothing special there. We've got obviously the 3 Kit, the 3 Fractal, the 3 Nerval, and then 2 Karaz. That's pretty typical. That's sort of the agreed upon settled quantity of each of these. From there, I elected only to run 1 copy of Rescue Cat. This is a little bit of an interesting one because over the course of the month, I've been running 3 copies of Rescue Cat. Towards the last week, getting closer to the event, I ended up cutting it to 1. You know, it's one of those cards that, obviously, when the effect resolves, you basically win the game. It's easily the best starter. It's, in some cases, the best extender if you have the ability to do so. I think I maybe should have continued to run 3. It looks like a lot of people had a lot of success with 3 copies of Rescue Cat. I ended up obviously running only the single copy. It's searchable off Omen, which was the logic there, but maybe in retrospect, I should have stuck to my guns and played 3. The thing is, I don't like Gamma, and this deck doesn't include Gamma. And Gamma plus Rescue Cat is usually just game. You know, if you Gamma and Ash Blossom and then resolve Rescue Cat, it's hard to lose from that. So only running 1 Rescue Cat with the 0 Gammas made a little bit of sense, but in retrospect as a whole, maybe I should have continued running. And this is where the deck gets a little bit interesting because at this point you're like, all right, it's just standard Tri-Brigades. Why am I even watching this? Well, in the main deck, Joe and I settled on 3 copies of Nibiru, only 2 copies of Ghost Bell, only 2 copies of Ash Blossom, 2 copies of Phantasme, and then a DD Crow. So our logic here was to have a diverse fleet of hand traps and limit the amount of once per turn hand traps. Obviously, Ash, generally considered the most generic and useful hand trap. I say in some cases it's actually relatively low impact depending on the matchup. You know, just Ash isn't going to save you against Drytrons. And as a result, you don't really want to have multiples of that. Ghost Bell is another one of those cards. You never really want to have multiples. Really, quite frankly, none of the once per turns because depending on the matchup, Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually lasts 1 or 2 turns as a whole. So if you have multiple once per turn hand traps, you usually lose because of it. Phantasme helps filter out a little bit of that. If you have double Ash, you can obviously put 1 away. Maybe Phantasme itself can draw into a hand trap. And the hand trap lineup really relates to the next decision that makes this deck a little bit interesting relative to other Tri-Brigade decks. And although I only went 2-2 drop, I still stand by this. Joe and I settled on main decking 3 copies of Shared Ride. Now, Joe didn't play in the event, but Joe and I worked on the deck. But we talked about 3 copies of Shared Ride as an interesting sort of pseudo hand trap, and it goes off a lot of what the OCG is doing. In the OCG, they have Maxi as a legal hand trap in 3, and as a result, those decks tend to run a more diverse field of hand traps, because if your opponent tries to take the Maxi challenge, if you draw double Ash, it's the same as drawing Ash and a brick. If you have a more diverse fleet of hand traps, though, you know, a Crow, a Phantasme, a Ghost Bell, and a Nibiru, when your opponent tries to take the Maxi challenge, they're going to have to play through different iterations of hand traps. And I guess I should also point out that there's also Triple Impermanence, which, although is a trap card, you know, it's basically another hand trap. When you Shared Ride someone, depending on the matchup, they also are posed with that same decision. Do I take the Shared Ride challenge? Against a deck like Drytrons, for them to fully combo, they're going to add cards to their hand quite frequently, whether it's the Ritual Spell from the Grave or Alpha Effect, Benton Effect, etc. if your opponent's comboing off with Drytrons, and you might not have a lot of hand traps at the beginning, if they give you 4 or 5 draws, plus maybe Phantasme draws incorporated into there, you might be able to stymie what they're doing. So the Shared Ride, in that sense, works as a pseudo-maxi against Drytrons. And then in the mirror match, if your opponent starts just with tanky, with the assumption that they can go Fractal, ditch Nerval, eventually get the search off of Bearbrum, you're going to draw 3 cards there. And even if they don't use tanky to start, if they have to get that Nerval effect first, you're going to at least draw 2 cards, which isn't the worst. Obviously, that deck itself, the mirror match, the opponent's not adding an exhaustive amount of cards, but it's not 0. It can at least get 2, and if their starter has to be tanky, it's 3, and that's pretty good. And what we talked about is the idea that Shared Ride, you have this assumption that it's only good going first, right? You establish your board, you set it, you stymie them, and then you win. Well, yes, Shared Ride is really good going first, but if your deck has a large amount of hand traps, particularly high impact hand traps like Nibiru, there's a reasonable chance that you can stymie your opponent on the first turn. And if you stymie your opponent with a high impact hand trap and then set Shared Ride going second, well, it's basically going to accomplish the same thing, because when you pass back to your opponent, now they're thinking, okay, I played through the hand traps, now it's my turn to win the game. Well, if I establish an Apollousa, Solemn Strike, set Shared Ride, now they have to play through Shared Ride and then play through the fleet of hand traps a second time. So it's a card that's actually good going first and second, which I think breaks the mold of how this card is usually evaluated. So we ended up main decking 3 copies of Shared Ride. I'll move these all up, and unlike my retro deck profiles, I'll show all of the cards on the screen at the same time. Because, although this deck is split up monster, spell, and trap, the way this deck works, it's really entwined with one another. We elected to go 2 copies of Desires. Joe Bogley really liked Prosperity in this slot. I elected to go with Desires instead. If he ran the deck, I think he would have elected to run Prosperity. Some of the side deck choices that we made, such as not using Anti-Spell Fragrance and having Imperial Order as our really only floodgate, made it so that I didn't feel like we were digging as much for a specific floodgate. And I liked the advantage, obviously, of the Desires. One card that was just unbelievable throughout my testing and even in the event itself, although I didn't play that long, was Triple Tactics Talent. It seems like, for me, the best way of winning the mirror match is to try and bait out the Revolt and then just Talents the Omen and kill them with Axis Kotaker. In my round 2 mirror match, that's how I won both games 1 and 3. Game 1, I Talenced his Omen after baiting out the Revolt, attacked him for game with Axis Kotaker and his Omen. Game 2, he opened Apollousa, Imperial Order, and I just scooped. Game 3, same deal. We baited out the Revolt. I actually mind-controlled his Apollousa, which previews the side deck a little bit. And then I Talenced his Omen and ended up attacking for game. So this card has just been incredible, particularly with the exhaustive amount of hand traps that people are running. Then we ran 1 copy of Monster Reborn. Monster Reborn hasn't really been a staple in this deck, but this deck doesn't have a lot of natural extenders. Old Patrick Hoban theory suggests that your deck really should have over 10 of them, and this deck has Karaz as an extender. And other than the Link monsters themselves, you're not really going to be extending. If your Blossom or your Bearbrum gets negated, you're not special summoning again that turn. So a card like Reborn seemed really good. It also combos really well with Rescue Cat. You can summon Rescue Cat, it can get Veilered or Impermed, and you can just go into Almirage and then Reborn Cat and keep playing. So I really like Monster Reborn. We main decked 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster. This was a concession, obviously, to Sky Striker and other back row decks. Horrible against Drytron, but this deck, as you're well aware, I don't have to explain this, can just put it back to the bottom when needed or shuffle it into the deck with Phantasme. And then this choice is a little odd because most people play 3 tankies, but we elected only to run 1 tanky, and I know that's going to seem really weird, but one of the bits of logic of only running 1 tanky is that if we do Shared Ride, we want Imperm to be a live hand trap that we can draw, and if we use tanky, the Imperms that we draw off the Shared Ride are dead. Maybe that should have resulted in us playing Effect Veiler instead, but Imperm has a little bit more flexibility against back row decks. So we elected only to run 1 tanky, which I know is a little odd, right? It's basically considered a staple. But to me, this deck already reached the threshold of starters from old Patrick Hoban theory. Old Hoban theory talked about if you had about 11 starters in a deck of 40, there's about an 80% chance of opening one. I will already say this deck is above 40, so the numbers don't work out perfectly, but it's only a few percentage points off, and you're looking at 3 Fractal, 3 Kit, 3 Nerval, Rescue Cat itself, the 1 tanky. I consider Pot of Desires on that borderline, but even without counting Pot of Desires, that's already 11 cards. And to me, every subsequent tanky is completely dead. I mean, it's the worst feeling in the world when you conduct your first turn and you do something with a starter, and now you desires later on and you draw tanky and it's just dead. Or you shared ride and you're drawing tankies. You just don't want those. One Tri-Brigade usually results in Tri-Brigades for the rest of the game because you can chain block the searches as you go along. And the game doesn't really last long enough anyway. So to me, having one Tri-Brigade was more than enough, or one tanky to search the Tri-Brigade once was more than enough. One of the big questions was, did I lose games because I didn't have starters? Well, in the short amount of games that I played in the event, it happened once, but I think that game was a little unusual anyway. And the cards that I had in my hand weren't cards that would have been copies of tanky. And in testing leading up, it wasn't an overwhelming problem, particularly with the big hand trap emphasis. If you have the hand traps, you can survive until you draw into a starter. So that's why we elected only to run one tanky, and it goes with some of our side deck plans too. From there, the rest of the deck's pretty standard. We have 3 Revolts, 3 Solemn Strike, and then Imperial Order. Solemn Strike's just incredible with Nibiru. You can, going first, stop Drytron, stop any of those combo decks, those FTK decks. But this was the main deck. Obviously, it's a little bit above 40, which is a little bit odd, but I don't mind going above 40 as much as other players, and with Desires, I think it's okay. Next step, we'll obviously talk a little bit about the side deck. For the side deck, we had 3 copies of Cycle Reader against Drytrons. The 2 losses that I had were actually against Drytron, so maybe I should have decided even more than this, but 3 copies of Reader. I did not elect to use Droll and Lockbird because, with Shared Ride, you kind of want your opponent to take the challenge. And against Drytrons, if your deck has DD Crow, 3 Readers, 3 Nibirus, you have Strike that could be set leading up to this, Bell, which isn't great. Oftentimes you decide it out. But Ash Blossom, in theory, you should be able to stymie them. And as a result, you kind of want your opponent to take the challenge under Shared Ride. So we elected not to play Droll and Lockbird. 1 Pank, obviously just a generic power card. We have 3 copies of Lightning Storm. Using only 1 tanky gave us the ability to play the Blowout spell and trap card removal. So I'll even show you that we also played 3 copies of Evenly Match. I know Evenly runs into Lancia, which can be a problem because people often side deck against this deck. But the logic here between the 3 Storm and the 3 Evenly was that against Sky Striker, everyone's prepared for Imperial Order and Anti-Spell Fragrance by siding in MST, Twin Twister, Cosmic Cyclone, cards of that iteration. Well, if your opponent is expecting Anti-Spell, or more specifically Imperial Order, it's unlikely that they're going to shotgun an MST on a back row in fear of Imperial Order. They'll usually try to sequence it in such a way that they always hold their quick play back row removal. And as a result, your back rows are generally pretty safe. So cards like Strike and whatnot are generally safe in the back row. And if your opponent is siding in those cards, they're there for Imperial Order, and your opponent's not going to shotgun them. So in that sense, like I just said, your back rows are generally safe. And as a result, if you try and hit them on a different axis, an axis that they can't counteract as well, which is just destroying all their back rows with Evenly or Lightning Storm, they're going to be stuck with cards like MST and Cosmic Cyclone that don't really counteract what your deck is trying to do. Like, for example, if you hit them with one of these and then set Revolt, who cares if they have MST or Cosmic Cyclone or any of those? It doesn't really do anything. You just took advantage with the back row sweepers. And because we're only running 1 tanky, these cards become really live. As a matter of fact, in the Striker matchup, any matchup where these 6 come in, I side out that single tanky, and the numbers work out such that we could actually have the space to do that. So we ended up having all of that. One card that you probably noticed wasn't in the main deck was Called by the Grave. I know this seems a little bit weird, and in retrospect, maybe I should have just mained it. Yeah, obviously, it's great against just a variety of matchups, but we wanted to have as many cards in the main deck that you could draw off of Shared Ride in the moment to counteract, and it forced us to make some cuts. This deck's already above 40, and I don't know how many more cards in the deck that I would be willing to cut. So Call by the Grave was in the side deck. We sided it in, or I sided it in quite frequently, to be honest with you. Mind Control, this card is an absolute blowout in the mirror match. You just take their Apollousa, and it puts them into this really weird situation where they have Revolt set, and they can sequence their Chain Link such that the Omen resolves, but you negate usually the kit, right? They're going to go Omen, Nerval, Kit as Chain Link 3. But the problem there for them is if they Omen in to kill the Apollousa on your board, well, now they've just used their Interruption. So if they don't have hand traps, you usually can beat them. And then when you combine this with Triple Tactics talent, it's just insane because then you just take the Omen and you kill them. So it puts them into this really awkward position where if you can bait out earlier in your plays, the Revolt with the Apollosa now on your side of the field, you just win the game. So Mind Control, absolutely incredible. It's obviously good against Sky Striker too. And then 3 copies of Ice Dragon's Prison. This was a concession to some of the, the Eldritch decks, to a lesser extent, some of the more, unusual decks that you can encounter. I actually sided it in the mirror match. You take one of their Tri-Brigades, you banish the one on the board. That matchup with the lack of extenders is such a in-the-moment normal summon-centric matchup, right? If you stop their first normal summon, you can usually win. It can be a little bit awkward if they don't have the right type in the graveyard relative to what they normal summon, but it usually wasn't a problem, particularly in the aftermath of Revolt. And this is just one of those cards that, it's hard to counteract because it can bait out Bell and then their Revolts are live, so it puts your opponent into this weird issue where they want to Revolt or they want to Bell it, but they also have to worry about Revolt. So I liked Ice Dragon's Prison. It worked out pretty well leading up to the event and in the mirror match that I did play. In terms of the extra deck, it's relatively generic. Almirage. We cut Gamma. As you notice, there's no Gamma. Gamma is another one of those cards I just despise. And as a result, we had space for both of the Nightmares. Then from there, it's pretty generic. Apollosa, Access Code Talker. I'm not playing Prosperity, so only one of some of these. Ancient Dragon Lords, Doom Eagle, 1 silver, double Rampart, double Barret, Blossom, and then obviously the 3 Omen. As a whole, I did enjoy the event. Round 1, I played against Mystic Mind Burn. I was able to win game 1, game 2. He Mystic Mind me. Game 3, I was able to hold my Lightning Storms and then overload his back rows. I never put a monster on the board. He established Field Barrier, Mystic Mind, so I basically just kept drawing until I drew all of my Lightning Storms, and then just went Storm, Solemn, Storm. That one resolved, killed his Field Barriers, killed his Cauldron, end phase, his Mystic Mind destroyed, and then I was able to use my set spell and trap cards to stymie his following turn, and I just OTK'd him. Round 2, I played a mirror match. Game 1, I went first, established Apollosa Revolt, ended up winning. Game 2, he went Imperial Order Apollosa turn 1. I scooped. Game 3, I Talenced and took his guy. I mind controlled his Apollosa earlier in the turn, and I kind of talked about that when talking about the deck itself. Round 3 was my first loss. I played against Drytron. I won the roll, won game 1. It was a really back and forth game. I opened really slow like Kit, going to Almirage Pass. He played through a good chunk of my hand traps, but I was able to stymie them with a Nibiru at a perfect time, make it so that he had to pass the turn. He kept playing a little bit, but ended just on Link Karibo plus a Drytron, and I was able to win the game in the aftermath of that, because the Kit searched Nerval, and then I just OTK'd with Access Code. And then game 2, he FTK'd me. Game 3, I opened kind of slow, and he was able to gain life points in time. Like in the game, he used double Cosmic Cyclone to go down to 6,000, but in time, he used Natasha and gained 2,500 life points and ended up beating me in time. He was going to win regardless of time. He was just in a much better position. I had no hand traps. Pass was just Nibiru, and then he ended up doing combos when time was called. So although I lost in time, he would just have won naturally, so I wasn't upset about that. Though in the moment, I didn't know his deck could gain life points. So I was like, oh, this is great. How is he going to gain 2,000 life points? Well, he could gain 25, apparently. And then in round 4, I lost against Drytron. Game 1, I opened up with Dragon Lords, stymied some of his plays. He played through really well. He ended up going into a Nightmare Phoenix, which made it awkward because I had Solemn Strike and Nibiru, but I ended up winning. Game 2, he FTK'd me, and then game 3 was a really awkward game. With what I know in retrospect and in hindsight, it was a very winnable game, but in the moment, I didn't really assess it the way I should have. The game opened where I basically had 4 hand traps and then Imperial Order. He goes, activate Cyber Emergency, I Imperial Order, and he passes to me. At that moment, I really should have evaluated him as having either all spells or being 1 card off from trying to combo without spells. And my hand with a bunch of hand traps, I really should have just set Ash and then eventually Tribute Summon for Nibiru. And I drew into a Karaz. I summoned the Karaz, so I interpreted the game state such that I could be chipping away correctly. So I summoned the Karaz and attacked. But what I really should have evaluated at that point was when he drew and passed again, that he was in such a weakness that I should have just set Ash and then tributed for Nibiru. It seemed weird with Imperial Order up to be doing that. From my perspective, if I drew any of my starters, and this is where the conversation comes in, where you're like, you cut Tanky. Well, I'm like, yeah, in this game, if I Tanky with an Imperial Order, it doesn't do anything. And I'm not cutting hand traps, right? I'm going to keep the density of hand traps regardless. So the fact that I had only 1 Tanky in my deck, I don't think really mattered. But I really should have evaluated it where my hand was something like Nibiru, Cycler Reader, Ash, and then Karaz, where I should have really just said, you know what? I can sacrifice Karaz and then another hand trap tribute summon for Nibiru and then keep Imperial Order with something like Cycle Reader in my hand, but I didn't. And then when I eventually did start to piece together that I should have been making that play, I made the mistake of going into Nightmare and using its effect, and it got hit by Herald of Orange Light. That was a huge mistake. Should have definitely seen that coming. And then he eventually just Drytron, tributed for Lancia, and then attacked me for game. So in retrospect, it was a game that was very winnable, where I should have zeroed in on the game plan being tribute summon for Nibiru, beat down with Imperial Order up. But I played a little bit too passive and passed a couple turns with a bunch of hand traps and Karaz, and ended up, by the time I ended up realizing I needed to shift game plans, I ended up making a mistake in doing so by using the Phoenix effect, which was silly. Theoretically, he could have went Drytron and then tribute set for Lancia, and now he would have stymied the 1900 attack off Phoenix, and by that point the Imperial Order was actually going to pop off, and he would have had the spell and trap. But I should have tributed summon in for Nibiru as opposed to going to Phoenix. It felt like one of those things where, you know, I have Imperial Order up with Cycle Reader and Nibiru in hand. How is he going to beat me? But the 700 life points off of Imperial Order started to add up. So that one was on me for sure. But that was my 2-2 tournament experience. Deck was cool. I'm going to move on to a different deck. One of the best pieces of advice I can give to players who are returning is don't just stick to one deck forever. Stick to a deck until you think you understand what the deck is trying to do, and then immediately switch to something else, because you have a lot of catching up to do. The better you understand all the decks, the better you will, one, be able to play yourself, but two, also be able to stop your opponent at the right time. So that's one of the main reasons I'm making this deck profile is I had fun with Tri-Brigade, but I'm putting it aside and picking something else. But anyway, for those of you who watch Modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, hopefully you enjoyed this little take on my YCS experience. Thank you for watching. Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. Primarily retro, though.